You know, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount is thought of as a collection of Jesus' teachings. Whether or not he preached these teachings in one time on one mountain in one time and place, scholars don't really know. But regardless of whether or not it was one sermon or whether or not it was this collection of sermons, it is in fact thought of as one of the greatest selections of Jesus' teachings ever put together within Scripture. And Matthew is the one that really highlights this more than all the other Gospels. And as you read through the Sermon on the Mount, there are particular places within the sermon where there are some challenging things that Jesus says. And they are so challenging, in fact, that a lot of times as you read it, you find yourself wondering, is he really serious? I mean, does Jesus really expect us to do that? But you know, if they are Jesus' words, and if Jesus does expect us to live in the way that he calls his disciples to live in that sermon, then we need to figure out how to put some of this into practice. And yet, again, some of this is so difficult. And perhaps one of the most difficult places within the Sermon on the Mount comes in chapter 5 of Matthew, verses 43. This is what it says there. You have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Now, again, I don't know about you, but I think that whole concept for me is one of the most difficult concepts in all of Scripture and in all the Sermon on the Mount. Love your enemies. I have struggled, I think, in my own life with how to do that more than many other things in Scripture. How do I love my enemies? What is the first step to loving my enemies? So I had a really interesting response to that, or a really interesting thought, I guess, that came to that. You know what Jesus doesn't say in here? He doesn't say, don't have enemies. I mean, that was kind of like this revelation for me, right? Jesus doesn't say, you have heard it say you should love your neighbor and hate your enemies, but I tell you, don't even have enemies. Jesus doesn't say that. Jesus says, love your enemies. So you know what? In order to love my enemies, I need to identify them. Unless I can identify those that I view as being against me, those who would receive this label of being my enemy, how am I ever going to move to a place of loving them? The interesting thing is, if I ask any individual to name their enemies, I think most people are going to say, well, I don't have any enemies. I don't really have any enemies. Oh, I've got people that I don't like all that well, but I don't have any enemies, right? We all say that. And yet, if we're really honest with ourselves, there are probably some people in our lives that if we don't admit it with our mouth, we certainly do treat them with our actions as if they are enemies. So it's interesting in this passage where Jesus doesn't say don't have enemies, what he may be trying to tell us is the first thing you need to do in order to figure out how you're to love and care for those who persecute you, those who you don't get along with, those who are really difficult for you to understand, for you to love, is to name them. To name them maybe privately, maybe we name them in prayer. But in order for us to take that step of finding ways to reconcile or to heal a relationship with somebody that we might, in our own private minds, describe as an enemy, we have to first name them. So who is it? Who is it really difficult for you to love? Who is it? Persecute may be a hard word, but who is it that you feel is so against you that you find it extremely hard to ever even imagine liking them, let alone loving them? Who is it that causes you to stumble, that causes you to step back? Who causes you so much anger that you don't know how to go forward? Beginning by naming that person, lifting that person up in prayer, lifting to God your struggle with caring for them, with loving them, might be the first step. Now I say that's the first step, but I did not say that that's a magic step. There's nothing magic in any of this. But acknowledging is sometimes the first step towards any kind of healing or any kind of change we are ever going to experience in life. Acknowledging who gets in our way, who causes us anger, who causes us to struggle. Jesus said, do your best. Find a way to care about that person. And we'll see how God changes the relationship.